How do you help somebody to find their motivation within or their vision or their purpose? Because when people are connected to something that's really important to them and they truly want to do, that's when they get the results, not when somebody's like telling them what to do.
Welcome to Nursing Beyond the Bedside. I'm Audrey, your host, and a nurse who pivoted my path several years ago. After 8 years as a critical care nurse, I was ready for change. I craved higher pay and more flexibility, but was struggling to find a clear path forward. Fast forward through positions in recruiting, customer success, and marketing, and many lessons learned along the way. Today, I run Pivot Path, a company dedicated to empowering nurses to redefine their careers. This podcast is designed to help you navigate the journey from clinical bedside nursing to a fulfilling career that aligns with your passions and goals. Here, you'll discover inspiring stories from nurses who've gone beyond the bedside, successfully transitioning to non-clinical roles, or redefining their nursing career. Join us as we hear their stories and share actionable strategies to help you make your own leap. Whether you're a new listener curious about what lies beyond the bedside, or a returning audience member in need of some fresh motivation, this podcast is your go-to resource for exploring new opportunities that can transform your career. Let's get started. What if the life you were meant to live was waiting on the other side of reinvention? Today's guest is proof that we have more freedom and more creativity than we might think. We're joined by Stacy Prech, a board-certified nurse coach, freelance writer, and co-founder of Well and Whole, a coaching and lifestyle brand dedicated to helping people reconnect with their creativity, energy, and purpose. Stacy has worn many hats, from surgical tech to OR nurse, travel nurse, writer, and now coach and entrepreneur. Her path has been anything but linear, but every pivot has been rooted in one thing: a deep desire to live in alignment with who she truly is. In this episode, Stacy shares what it means to be a nurse coach, how mindset mapping and inner work can change everything, and why you don't have to settle for a life that doesn't light you up.
Thank you, Audrey. Your summary of that just like brings me joy. Thank you for having me.
Of course. Well, you have had such a rich and winding journey from surgical tech, OR nursing, travel nursing, writer, coach, entrepreneur, expat.
Yeah.
Can you walk us through a few of those key pivots and kind of what called you to shift along the way?
Yeah, of course. So like as I've been sort of telling the story and reflecting, and it's 2 years for me in Paris now, as of just the end of last month. And like Sarah and I have been doing a lot of reflections on this. And I think there's like a common thread that sort of ties through my whole story, which actually you summarized really well. But, something that I've sort of realized is we have these passions, we have things within us that like we really want to do, and we might sort of ignore them for a while to do something that makes sense, but we will always find our way back to them, or they will always find our way back to us. And it's very interesting to like see how that's happened. So that's like one overarching thing that I've realized. And something else is that like this whole concept of like personal development and seeing different possibilities. I mean, like if you would have told me 10 years ago that I would be living in Paris and like married to a French guy, I there's no way that I would believe that could happen even 5 years ago. So I think that, but what really got me started in this belief about these different versions of our lives or different versions of ourselves before I even knew anything about coaching or mindset work or anything was really traveling. So I think that there's these pieces that kind of have come together that now I can see like how they have created my story and like where I am. Kind of like, yeah, why did everything happen this way? But yeah, I think that just seeing that sense of like possibility, the discovering another place and culture was like priming my mind for so many things like before I ever knew why, but I knew that I like loved it.
Yeah. And it's interesting that you say that because I think that it can sometimes be hard to see beyond your current reality. And, I remember when I was at the bedside, I was working, I'd been travel nursing, and I loved travel nursing. I loved that adventure. But I had set myself down a path to become a CRNA because that was the path that I thought I was supposed to go down, right? Like I was travel nursing, but I wanted to make more pay and I wanted to have more flexibility than just like a bedside nurse on a unit. So what next? And CRNA was like the most logical thing in my mind. I really I couldn't see past that to, oh, what if I go work remote in health tech and never have to go to a hospital again? Like
Oh,
that was
yeah.
not a reality that added up for me until I actually, I don't know, explored it, but I had to have help exploring it, to be honest. Like my husband was really influential in those conversations of kind of like helping me see past that reality that I'd been living in for so long. And so I'm sure, it sounds like with the coaching that you do, that probably resonates with you some of just being able to have that conversation with someone else, because sometimes it takes that other voice to come and
Yeah.
pull you out of the reality that you're in and see what options are out there for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's like such an interesting part of your story because I know a little bit about your story, but I didn't know, like all of the small details about that. But I think, yeah, I mean, in terms of the ways that we limit ourselves, and like I feel like a lot of the language is so mainstream, like everybody has heard of a limiting belief nowadays, but what they
Mm-hmm.
haven't heard or maybe don't know is that a limiting belief isn't something that is like waving a red flag around at you and saying like, here, I'm a limiting belief. It's like something that you truly believe is the way it is or is the way that you are, or like,
Mm-hmm.
well, that's my personality, or this is my situation and like this is how it's going to be. So it's like it's really sneaky.
Yeah, definitely. And, along the way, was there a specific moment for you, or how did you start to realize that you are allowed to want more and you can do something different?
I love this question because when Sarah and I got into the OR, also for anybody that doesn't know, Sarah's my twin sister, but probably everybody is going to know that. When we first got into the OR as surge techs, like before that, she wanted to do something creative. I wanted to do something in teaching, but this was the thing that we were like, this kind of makes sense for the time. Let's try it out. It was very like uncharacteristic of me at the time and of both of us to just be like, well, let's see, we had already been in college for a few years and we're like, let's do this. So basically like the second we got into clinicals, we both had the same realization of like, wait, this is what a nurse does in the OR. Like, we're there as like little baby scrub techs, and then we see the circulator or the fact that nurses can scrub too. And we were like, nobody ever told us this before, and I think that actually
Mm-hmm.
this idea of things that nobody tells you, it's like, and then once you find that out, I think it didn't ever really occur to us that we didn't have a choice to do something. But I will say
Mm-hmm.
that the fact is that us going through like this journey together, I mean, there's no doubt in my mind it made it a lot easier for us to do that, knowing that like when you have somebody who knows exactly what you're going through, it gives you like so much power, so much validation,
Mm-hmm.
so much, that's like, well, yeah, like we both just kind of knew that we were going to do the next thing. And I think also it's like when you're in that environment and you see that it's very normalized, then it gives you permission to do that. So that, I mean, in the beginning, I think that's kind of like what influenced our mindset. But then also, I think that we had this story in our minds that like, okay, we're these people who are doing things a little differently, like nursing was already a second career, even though we were in our early 20s. And like we had already started to travel and we already had people saying like, how do you do this? How do you do that? So I think that like I think very honestly, like we had convinced ourselves that like we're the type of people that kind of do things out of the box.
Yeah. And I think calling out that you had somebody right there with you is really significant because it
Yeah,
can feel kind of isolating to be the one who is going against the grain or to
yeah,
feel like the aspirations that you have are so much different than that of your peers. So
yeah.
that's interesting that you call that out. And can you elaborate some or tell us a little bit more about your initial decision, like after working as a nurse,
Yeah.
what what was it that spurred you then to say, okay, like then let's move on to the next thing. Let's pivot
Yeah.
from
Yeah.
bedside nursing. And what is that going to look like?
Yeah, sure. And something else, I already forgot exactly what it was that you said, but made me think of this other thing that I wanted to say to tie into everything we just said. You know, there was
Yeah.
something else that was easy for us, which I want to call out, like the fact that we were in this environment with kind of a lot of different people. We were exposed to a lot in the OR with like different disciplines and lots of interesting people. But people always sort of singled us out as like, oh, you're traveling. Like, and when I say traveling, I don't mean travel nursing. Like we did do that, but traveling for fun and like enrichment of our lives and stuff. And people always like put us on this little bit of a pedestal for that. So there was this validation for that. So, a lot of times when you go against the grain and do something different, like you're not rewarded and people kind of
Right.
tear you down a little bit. And that also happened in some ways. But we did have this example in our lives of like us doing something different being actually kind of celebrated. And people are like, how
Mm,
did you do it? So I think it's also important to call that out because it's not always going to be that way. In that case, that
right.
was that was a good thing that it sort of gave us that energy and momentum. But like
Hmm.
when we decided that we wanted to leave the bedside, so this is also something I want to call out is with burnout. I think that it took me a while to realize that I think we went through burnout like more than once. And
Mm,
a lot of times I feel like within nursing, we just hear the word over and over again, and we're kind of like, okay, burnout, whatever. Like we all know somebody who's had to, take FMLA or, they're the ones who are really suffering. But at the same time, we talk ourselves out of the fact that we are or we have been because we know
hmm.
somebody who has suffered more than us. And so we sort of like judge ourselves and like invalidate that part of our experience. But now I can look back and like so clearly see that like we were like I think we both like we burned out more than once and it was for a while and it's like what that I think really did spur me on and us really on to say like gosh we have to do something else like we have to do something different. This has been
Mm,
a good adventure. This has been like a great ride, but like there's no way that I can do the same thing day in day out like for the next I don't know 30, 40 years.
hmm. Yeah, definitely. And do you feel like with each transition, do you feel like there was something emotional that you experienced or had to come over, or even an identity shift that you
Oh, that's
experienced and
good.
had to move through along the way?
Oh my gosh, I love this question. Yeah. So, like, before we found the nurse coaching specialty, we actually had thought about, okay, we'd heard about remote nursing and jobs that non-clinical types of things. And we tried to like transition into that. If only we had known you then, maybe our story would have taken another turn. But yeah, I think so. We just had these feelings of like I can't keep doing this. But the other thing is realizing like how even though we have a lot of feelings about identifying ourselves, okay, I'm a nurse or I'm this specialty or I'm that specialty.
Hmm.
And we all kind of know that it's like a little toxic to overly identify, but it still shows up in a lot of ways. So when we had heard about like nurse coaching and decided, hey, let's do this certification program. This seems really great. Like, we loved what we were learning. But so there was the transition like into this identity of of a nurse as an entrepreneur and a nurse as a coach, because also like nurse coaching isn't that well known within
Mm-hmm.
nursing even now. And we started doing this like I think 4 years ago was when we first found the program. So it's becoming a little more known and a little more mainstream. But that was also, it's like, oh, that was a case of like, oh, nobody understands what we're doing. Okay, let's explain it to them. But like, let's figure this out. We're still figuring out what this means for us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that nurse coaching is still something that is not super well known. And so for listeners who have never heard of nurse coaching, how would you
Yeah.
describe what that means and what you do as a nurse coach?
Yeah. Yeah. So first I will shout out the American Holistic Nurses Association. That is the branch. So there's a holistic nursing certification and a nurse coaching certification. And so nurse coaching, yeah, also fun fact that nursing is the first licensed profession in the United States anyways that has a coaching certification. Because I
Hmm.
think, it's very easy to see like online nowadays, like basically anytime somebody's offering a service that's one to one, they call it coaching. And so that gets a little bit confusing. But what
Hmm.
nurse coaching is, it basically draws on a number of like disciplines, like, psychology, positive psychology. You have, this aspect of like motivational interviewing, and then like the nursing specialty and therapeutic communication itself. So I think like the easiest way to explain this is that it's like a problem solving and communication technique that helps people achieve a goal. I guess that's probably like the nutshell answer of like what is nurse coaching. I would also say therapeutic communication on steroids.
Because in nursing school, we get told that therapeutic communication is you can't agree with someone, you cannot disagree with somebody, you can't tell them what to do. So it's like, well, what's left?
And so we just learn a little bit about the fact that it's important to listen to people, but like we don't really learn much more than that. So this is like the whole next level of like, here are tools and skills, and this is how you help somebody to change their behavior. Because like honestly, a lot of nurses begin with some sort of application to patient care or health coaching, or teaching or precepting. So it's like, yes, how do you help somebody to find their motivation within, or
Hmm.
their vision or their purpose? Because when people are connected to something that's really important to them and they truly want to do, that's when they get the results, not when somebody's like telling them what to do.
Yeah, definitely. And tell us a little bit about what a typical day or a week looks like in your work as a
Yeah.
nurse coach and having your own business built around that.
Yeah, yeah. So, typically, well, I work from home remotely, although I live in Paris now. So I do go to some in-person events and like meet people locally and connect with them. And I also run some events and workshops here. But yeah, most of it is working from home on my computer. It's a lot of, I mean, yeah, networking for lack of a better word, like getting to
Hmm.
know people, offering to, give them an experience of what the coaching is like. We might be in a conversation where you say like, I'm really like feeling burned out. I don't know what's next. Hey, would you like to talk about that? Would you like to explore that? And so yeah, like it really looks like having conversations like that. And then some people are ready to actually do something about it. A lot of people are not. But yeah, and then some people want assistance, some people don't. So that's kind of what that looks like. And having sessions with people, they're usually anywhere from an hour to 90 minutes long. And then so that's like the side of the business that you would say, here's the service. And then of course
Hmm.
behind that there's administrative stuff like
Yep.
social media and website and blog and email and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, definitely. And that stuff takes up a lot of time. Just
Sure does.
keeping your business in front of people is hard. It's time consuming.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And I'm yeah, obviously you know exactly what that's like.
Yeah. And so with Well and Whole, what kinds of clients are you working with, or what sort of transformations or people or outcomes are people looking for when they choose to work with you as a coach?
Yeah. Yeah. So a lot of the clients that we work with, it's mainly nurses. Like we're not like exclusive in our marketing that way because like to be quite honest, a lot of the issues that we help people work through as nurses are also very much like issues that women deal with. And so I've realized this just from like my experience here in Paris where I don't most of the people that I connect with here are other, expats women who I'm like, oh, wait a minute, we're kind of all in the same boat here, aren't we? But yeah,
Mm-hmm.
lots of nurses in leadership as well. So yeah, in terms of like how do people use like what does the conversation look like? How do they find us? What do they start with? A lot of times people feel like their life, like their work and life is very out of balance. Sometimes they are considering like a career change, not always out of nursing, but maybe just, okay, I don't know if I want to still be, in leadership. And that's really scary to have a conversation about, or like,
Mm-hmm.
maybe going into a different specialty. But the other component about that is people that we work with, like, so yeah, sometimes they do end up making a big change like that. But the thing that happens much more commonly is once they get their work and life in balance, a lot of times they don't actually find that they need to. And so this is an interesting realization for us to come to because we would never say, like, my goal is to keep you where you are. That's for them to decide. But there's a story that I tell all the time because it's one of my favorite stories. So I was working with a nurse who is at the director level, and this was her. Like she thought maybe she wanted to go into aesthetics or concierge nursing or something. Like she had all these dreams of doing something completely different than what she was. And she had a lot of issues around unworthiness in spite of having two master's degrees, in spite of having like being this highly skilled, like highly competent, like woman and nurse, she had a lot of issues around like the way that she saw herself, like her self image, her self worth. She had burned out previously and she was very afraid of like burning out again in her role
Mm-hmm.
and was dealing like with a lot of stress at work. So what we had worked through was really her relationship with herself. She was struggling to take time for herself. And so in the beginning, she saw herself as like a rebel in staff meetings and she didn't know if that was okay. She felt like she had a lot of anger and resentment. And, the term that I don't know if debriefing the front lines came up with this, but the institutional betrayal, so yeah, a lot of our clients have a lot of these strong feelings that they like don't really know what to do with.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that was sort of where things began. And then once, and so we worked on the practical details of like, well, what would it actually look like to take these big goals and break them down into small steps that are manageable, but of course, like what comes up with that are like, okay, here's the fears, here's the doubts, like, how do we work through those? Because those are the things that actually keep you from taking action. So by the end of the time that we had worked together, she took more PTO in the time that we were working together than she did like ever in her nursing career,
Oh
which
my
is like
gosh.
which is what I think my proudest statistic. And I talked to her a year later. This was like just a few months ago. I talked to her and she was saying that it's just so funny because she's like, I actually had to check my PTO balance like the last time I went on vacation. And it's funny because like for her that's like the ultimate metric. That means she's actually using it because like it's
Mm-hmm.
very common for nurses to burn out with lots of PTO in the bank.
Yeah, definitely.
So
Yeah. I feel like sometimes just having that other person to help you sort out those feelings that you're having, the thoughts that are kind of circling in your head that you can't totally make sense of, I think is
Yeah.
just so valuable. And so, yeah, I'm sure that that's where the being like a certified coach really comes into play, is
Yeah.
that ability to critically listen to what the other person is saying. And instead of, giving them instruction, helping them
Yeah.
to kind of see it and find it for themselves. That's really special.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. And I think the other thing too is it's like, a lot of that sounds very intangible. Like I get it. So it may be difficult for people to imagine like, okay, like how does this really change things? But, the other thing is that when you're working in something like coaching around, the kinds of issues that our clients have, the mindset work and how they see themselves like really truly determines the actions that they do or don't take. And a lot of
Mm-hmm.
times it's like the ways that we keep ourselves stuck are the expectations we think that other people have of us. And like sometimes that's accurate and sometimes it's totally inaccurate. And one of the things that I just really appreciate so much about like learning with coaching is, learning how our brain works, learning how our mind works, like understanding that just because a thought enters your head doesn't mean it's who you are. Like just because you've even had a lot of thoughts about something, it doesn't make them true. Understanding what are cognitive distortions, what are things that we think that because before you kind of do any mindset or personal development work, you just sort of assume that all the thoughts floating through your head are like true, that
Mm-hmm.
they're, maybe that they're there for a reason, that you don't really have any control of what goes in or out. And like once you realize that none of that's true, like it really changes everything.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know that, to address this, you've mentioned mindset mapping. Can you
Yeah.
explain like what mindset mapping is and why that is a powerful tool?
Yeah, yeah. So something that I started to realize, like the more nurses especially that I worked with, is that we have all these patterns that we carry with us. And I think like, if we draw a parallel to this, a lot of people are now familiar with this idea of like inner child work and like, things that happen to you as a kid still affect your behavior and thought patterns as an adult. So I feel like this is totally something that happens in nursing that we're not necessarily talking about, but like the survival patterns and coping mechanisms that we build for ourselves when we're like little baby nurses in school, like and even in in early in our career or in our bedside jobs, there are all these things that we have to do to just kind of make it through. But when you leave the bedside, whether that is to do something non-clinical, remote, going into leadership, or leaving healthcare entirely, all of that stuff like doesn't just go away. So like things that that the success of our jobs are often built on, like this good nurse image and mentality that we also like project on each other, even unknowingly. Or,
Mm-hmm.
like maybe this happened from your own leadership or management, but it's like people pleasing, perfectionism, because guess what? Like it could really hurt somebody if we make mistakes,
Right.
a sense of urgency for everything. Like I was just telling my friend this story because she just left her healthcare job. So all of this is like even more fresh because I just had this conversation yesterday. But like months after I wasn't working in the hospital anymore, and I would like say to my husband, like, "Oh, I'm just gonna run and pee real quick," and he's like, okay, but you don't have to be real quick. And I'm like, oh my gosh, like, but this is just like the things we would say at work. Like everything was real quick, or I'm going to run and do this, or I'm going to run and do that. And it's like, oh my gosh, like the way that, and whether I was actually rushing or not once I left, I don't know. But it's like the feeling that we still have to rush everything or that everything is urgent or this constant overwhelm from like lots of tasks or overstimulation. Like nobody gives us tools to manage that when we're working at the bedside, let alone tells us that like those patterns and habits that we develop over years are like, because, and again, this is like a very real thing. Like you leave the bedside or you leave healthcare and you think like, now I'm going to feel at peace or now I'm going to feel relieved. But like, if you don't like work through that stuff, you could still be sort of running all that programming essentially, just like out of habit by default, because maybe, yeah, you were in your bedside job for 10 years and you know what? That stuff is not going to work itself out overnight.
I am laughing over here hearing you describe this because I think I still do some of those things. Like
Yeah.
I think that, and I left the bedside 4 years ago, and specifically that constant sense of urgency and efficiency
Yeah.
still runs my life. Like, and
Yeah.
I don't know that I actually before, like right now, like this is all happening real time. Before
Yeah.
before hearing you say that, I don't think I would have connected that to me working in critical care for 8 years. I think I would have just
Yeah.
thought, this is just me. This is just how I operate. And so it's funny that you call that out, because I mean, even at home, I'm the same way. I'm like, okay, I need to go pee real quick. I'm going to do this.
Yep.
I'm going to
Yep.
do like X, Y, and Z as efficiently as possible. There is always urgency. So
Isn't that wild?
that's
Like,
really funny.
so wild.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So how can nurses, how can I
Yeah.
start to recognize those patterns and
Yeah.
start shifting that mindset? This is going to turn into a
Yeah.
coaching session right now, because you just
Oh,
made me
that's okay.
realize that.
That's what we're here for. Yeah. Yeah. And like something I wanted to say also along those lines, like as we were talking about this, like part of the reason I realized how long these things hang on, and I love that you had this insight, because for me it's 2 years, for you it's 4 years, but like my leadership clients are like, I can't figure out why I still do all these things, like not take bathroom breaks when I work at a desk now, or like I eat lunch at 2 when I could eat lunch at any time. Like they're
Mm-hmm.
also teaching me about like, goodness sakes, this stuff can stick around for like really. So, what we can do is, first of all, I think one of the biggest things is having the awareness of the fact that like this is a real phenomenon that we're facing. Because I think that the single biggest thing that we do when we don't have that awareness, and again, I was just having this conversation with a friend who she quit the OR like 2 days ago, and is basically like, yeah, not calling ourselves crazy or judging ourselves when, once we do start to realize this. Because at first this is kind of beneath our awareness. Okay, then we might
Mm-hmm.
have an awareness of what this is. But then also like really understanding that it's like, okay, like these habits and patterns have been there for a really long time. So I don't want to like start by, you don't want to start by judging yourself and saying I'm crazy because of this, or, this is so messed up. I mean, actually, maybe it is sometimes, but first of all, like allowing those things to be and kind of tracking, so like in your daily life, like you had this immediate realization, like, oh my gosh, I can already pinpoint where I think some of these things are. But sort of like, this could be something to journal on, this could be something to notice in the moment. Like, okay, like, yeah, what's my language? Like, am I saying things that are rushing myself? Do I know now? And I think this is something we've kind of talked about as well, but it's like, okay, as a business owner, you're not going to kill somebody if you make a mistake. So even just kind of like
Mm-hmm.
realizing where and how like these mindsets show up in how we approach like challenges and problem solving and failures or perceived failures. Like, so kind of tracking yourself in a day, like, okay, where do I notice these things showing up, and even with like, with people pleasing or with having no boundaries,
Mm-hmm.
because like, let's be honest, other people in management, leadership, sometimes the floor, the staffing, the patients, like everybody kind of benefits when we don't have boundaries, but we take that home with
Mm-hmm.
us. So like, And this was something I had to relearn all over again once I got married and even was out of the hospital. It was like, or I'd have family visit. I'm like, how come I can't make time for myself when like I am no longer in this tight schedule? Because this is something else. You transition out of
Mm-hmm.
bedside, you know, maybe it's still, you find that it's hard to like have healthy habits. So tracking your boundaries and saying like, yeah, okay, maybe it was hard for me to make time for myself before, but how about now? Or if you're still at the bedside, like, okay, at work, maybe it is hard to take a lunch break because you have to have somebody cover your patient or staffing is tight. But like, what about at home? Like, are you constantly putting
Mm-hmm.
everyone's needs before yours at home? And this is tricky. Like, this is tricky because in the beginning of me leaving the hospital, I still went through this. And I know other people who've gone through the same. It's like, yeah, I have more time now. Why is it still hard? And it's like, because it was never about the time that you had. It's about your like drive and your behavior patterns and like constantly being rewarded for putting other people's needs before your own.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm sure that a lot of what you're saying is resonating with a lot of listeners because I'm over here nodding my head like, yep, yep, I've experienced that. I've experienced that. And it's funny too, because it shows up in, little ways that you might not, like you said, like you might not even be aware for a long time. And I had a nurse leader at a health tech company that I worked with, kind of, I forget how it came up, but basically mentioned that with the nursing teams internally at that company, she was aware that it's hard for us to sit there and see like a little red notification circle on like our inbox or a Slack message or whatever and just not feel like we have to look at it the second it pops up because we're trained at the bedside. If there's an alarm, if there's an alert, like you need to look at that immediately. Like it should not
Yeah.
go ignored for a minute. And so I think it's funny, we have all of these shared experiences at the bedside, no matter what unit you work on, no matter what specialty you are, there's some commonalities across all of nursing. And so, yeah, I think that it's really interesting to me hearing you talk about all of this because I think that it is a common shared experience.
Yes, yes. And, I think like in addition to seeing that how these patterns like come into your life, like having the awareness, not judging yourself, looking at boundaries, tracking, also then realizing that, there are small things that you can do to sort of like get back to the present with yourself, get back in touch with your body. Because yeah, again, another thing is like when we're at the bedside, we're very much like put all your physical needs on hold too. So sometimes we still do that
Mm-hmm.
when we don't, when we no longer have to, either meaning at home after the shift or, post bedside career transition. So it's a full mind body like
Yeah.
assessment and, yeah, new habits, new thought patterns, things that take time and yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And, for nurses who maybe feel like they've been stuck in survival mode for a little while,
Yeah.
how can they
Yeah.
start to reconnect with their values and kind of their long-term vision for themselves?
Yeah, yeah, I love this question because I think that, when we're thinking about this idea of a long-term vision, I take this back to like, this was, a long-term vision and having something like a light at the end of the tunnel is so powerful for getting you out or getting you through something that's really hard in the moment. So something that we love to do is make vision boards. And I know this is like a very popular, like, beginning of the year activity, but you could really do it at any time. And it doesn't have to be for a specific amount of time. A lot of times people make a new one every year, but like basically stopping, pausing, journaling about things that are important to you or that you would love to do. And you can break up your life into different areas, like what your goals might look like, whether these are like personal, professional, travel, like maybe something with your house or whatever. And then finding images. So we love to use Pinterest and we also have a free resource for this, and then putting them together like on a board, like so much of the time when we are stuck in this survival mode, we don't give ourselves time to even think about what we really want. And that's for a number of reasons. Like, first of all, our brains are tired, but like, second of all, it can be painful to realize that there's a gap between like where you are and how you're living your life to something that you really want. And then it feels super far away. But like what neuroscience tells us is that just taking a little bit of time out to do that and like reconnect with what's really important to you, and then seeing visuals. So like having this, this could be like on your phone screen, or you could make a physical board and like keep it, in your room or in your office, or, somewhere where you can see it regularly, is kind of like, it's kind of the first step to really allowing yourself to like explore those other possibilities and put them into some sort of physical thing that you can bring to life.
Yeah, definitely. And something I also want to, go one level deeper on is this idea that we have more freedom than we might think. And I feel like this thought can kind of come into play when creating your vision board. What do you mean by we have more freedom than we might actually realize?
So I'm going to take a very specific example from a client, and then I can kind of get more general about it. But the way that we perceive other people and their expectations, or the limiting beliefs that we have about ourselves, are really what holds us back. And a lot of times we are the one holding us back. So the one client example that I have, like she was she was a nurse leader, but she worked in a team of physicians, and like all the physicians like never took their vacation. But she wanted to, but she was so afraid that if she did, that they would think that like she wasn't a hard worker. And, basically like what we broke that down into was her realization that like that's not, first of all, this is an assumption she's making about what they think or not. Just because they don't do it, they're probably not thinking about her taking her vacation at all. But if they are, like, okay, it's not their life, and but we limit ourselves like this all the time because of things that we're projecting on other people. So this can be our own assumptions of what they think. These can be like our brain's tendency to think of the worst case scenario. This is really like a form of self-protection, but it's a way that we just end up limiting ourselves that we don't have to. And so this happens a lot. I mean, this happens with challenging like the good nurse, persona that's out there. Or this can happen like in relationships and friendships and your family. But the thing is that like the common theme through all of that, it's not that okay, yes, we do work in toxic environments. We also might have toxic people around us, but there is always a degree of your power that you can take back when you understand the difference between like what you're projecting on other people and what's actually yours, and moving through like the fears and doubts of being able to do, like, deep down you have things that that you'd be happier if you did, but you're either limited by what you think other people are going to think if you do, or you're afraid because you're telling yourself that you can't do it. So removing those two blocks is really how you take your life back, and how you begin to realize that like you actually had the freedom to do things differently all along. Like that might not look like a huge overnight change, but even in small ways, like another example that I have that's really concrete is a client who I had. She's in anesthesia, and she would, before she would go home, she would ask everybody on her like team if they needed anything, like any help or a break. But nobody did that for her. And as nice as it was that she did that, she never got out on time. And then she was also like building resentment because she wasn't being treated with the same care. So, I mean, I'm not saying to people, don't be kind to your coworkers, don't offer them breaks, but really think about that. Like, it was actually her choice to go and do that. And it was her choice to do that made her not get home on time. And then she was upset because she's not getting home on time. So it's like, once she realized that she like, oh, actually that was completely up to me and I don't have to do that. There's other ways I can support people without overextending myself for them. And for nurses, this is really hard to like make this distinction. But so much of what burns us out is actually us overextending for others, because also we're just like in our culture, that's normal. 100% isn't enough. It's 110%, you know? So just doing actually your 100% or even 80%, let's get crazy, you know, like but it's so ingrained in us that if we're not overdoing, that it's not enough. So that I think is like, gosh, that's probably the biggest mindset shift right there that can help you to take your own power back and have more of your freedom.
Yes, definitely. And I want to round us out with this last question that will kind of maybe dive a little bit deeper on everything that you were just talking about, because there are lots of nurses who consider a career pivot and they feel afraid to do it or to even really look into it because it feels risky or it feels selfish. So what would you say to nurses who maybe are feeling that way about where they are in their career?
Yeah. So, you know, I think we have these two words, like risky and selfish. Like nobody likes those words, I think, generally speaking. But, you know, I think it depends on like where you are, because if you are at a place where you're like, maybe you've just started thinking about it, or maybe you've been thinking about it for a while, but like, you know, ask yourself like, what is the cost of things staying the same? Because often we don't really consider that when we're thinking about something being risky. But it's like you're totally willing to let resentment build and be mentally and physically exhausted all the time and not really be living the life that you want. So I think that really it's like, think it out all the way on both sides and really be real with yourself about like what that cost is that you are paying right now that's a little bit invisible because it's just how things are, or it's just your norm. So you're not counting it, you know, but you need to count it on both sides. The other thing is that it's like we look at everything like our next move has to be the only one and it's going to be forever. I think this is another huge mindset shift. It's like, what if your next step was just the next piece of your path? You know, maybe you'll do it and you'll love it, but maybe it's going to guide you to something even better. And it's like the whole idea of like, okay, but what if it doesn't work out? But what if it does? Like, take those golden handcuffs off, because like life can get so much better. And I think that it's like really when we're around people who haven't normalized this, like the word you mentioned earlier, it's so hard to see a way out, like see that way out when that's the people you're surrounded by. So the other thing is, it's like, if you want to start believing that this is possible for you, then yes, like, how do you make this normal to your brain? Like, talk to people who have done it, you know? And you have a great resource for that. But it really does, like, it is worth it. You're going to learn something no matter what. The next thing doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be all or nothing. It could be guiding you to something even better. But either way, like, you're going to go on an adventure. And yeah, again, really like counting that cost on both sides.
If you'd like to connect with Stacy after today's show, you can visit her website at www.livewellandwhole.com, connect with her on LinkedIn, or email her at hello@livewellandwhole.com. Thanks for tuning in. Don't forget to hit subscribe to keep up with our latest episodes. And if you were inspired by today's conversation, I hope you'll share this episode with someone who'd love it just as much as you did. If you're ready to pivot your path, sign up for my free newsletter at mypivotpath.com. Get non-bedside jobs delivered to your inbox every week. And if you have questions or just want to say hi, feel free to email me at audrey@mypivotpath.com. Thanks for listening, and until next time.